Okay, so I'm about to turn the floor over to Katerina, who will be reading Warrior by Graces Grove. And it's all you now, Katerina.
Good evening. Warrior by Graces Grove. She had been following the Legion for weeks as they battled their way through the countryside, always staying at least a half day behind them to avoid detection. Traveling during the day was more difficult for her, but it wasn't impossible. It started to drizzle rain, and she pulled her cloak closer against the autumn dampness. She laughed at the gesture, a remnant of her humanity, but kept the cloak tight around her. If anyone crossed the path, it would take them that much longer to notice her strangeness. Any advantage she could gain, especially during the day, was worth it. The road here was well travelled, and many of the stones were worn down, creating the divots where the rain started pooling. To amuse herself, she made a game of avoiding the puddles and skipped over those stones with preternatural athleticism. She could sense prey animals in the nearby wood, fearful, watching her from a safe distance. That dampened her spirit a bit, and she stopped skipping. She wasn't sure how much longer she would follow these men. It had crossed her mind a few nights ago to leave them, but something stopped her. She inhaled deeply to clear her thoughts, taking in the scents of the forests unlocked by the rain. She also detected the faint smell of men and sweat, and under that, blood. She wasn't hungry at the moment. She had been feeding well lately, but it was still intoxicating even at this distance. She could control the hunger now, but it hadn't always been that way. She remembered waking up changed. Watching her naked heart pump at her chest wound knitted itself back together. Seeing the Valkyrie walk away from her, leaving her on the battlefield among the dead. Knowing she was spared from the Great Hall forever. She was like an animal then, one of Odin's berserkers, killing everything in her path. Even now, a part of her wanted to run through the Legion's camp tonight, bearing death and destruction, screaming into the blackness, bathing in blood. She took another deep breath of the rainy forest and shook the images of terrified dying men from her mind. Maybe she was a true berserker now, joined forever with the beast, one of Odin's chosen. If that were true, why was she alone? What did he want from her? Surely not slinking around behind this foreign army feeding in on their scraps like a dog. But something kept pulling her forward. So she continued on the path, content and for the moment to resume skipping over puddles as darkness began to fall and the faint sounds of battle reached her ears. A few hours later, she caught up with the Legion in mid-battle. She remained on the periphery of the forest and climbed high into the branches of an oak tree to watch. Small fires burned at the edges, throwing a golden glow over everything. Horses ran down villages, crushing them under jet black hoofs. She squinted her eyes, and the beasts merged into one, reminding her of Odin's eight-legged steed, Sleipnir. Legionaries clashed with berserkers who ran through the fields naked, except for their masks and animal pelts, howling and cutting down men with a savage ferociousness. She wondered if they were like her under those masks, and watched closely to see if any were feeding. Her eyes were quite good in the dark now, one advantage of her current state, but she only saw men killing men. The smell of blood, mixed with mud, sweat, and shit, reached her nose. She could sense fear and the berserker's rage, but there was something else as well. No, not something. Someone. Someone else. A presence that she couldn't identify. She reached out with her senses to pinpoint the source, but there was too much going on. The smell of blood and fear was too strong, and she had to pull back or risk losing control and exposing herself. She wondered if she had finally found another of Odin's chosen, or maybe his cursed. He was a trickster after all. Perhaps Odin himself was there, watching from the shadows, or directing the battle. She sighed, allowing herself a moment of frustration, then found a comfortable spot among the leaves and waited for it to be over. She hummed as she made her way through the ravaged battlefield. Her seethed sword caressed her bare leg as she walked. The young and the old were here, fallen warriors on both sides, equal now in death. She paused for a moment on a small hill, surveying the destruction. The smell of wet earth and blood lit her senses on fire. Then she heard it, faint and delicate. She cocked her head to one side, eyes half closed, lips parted, tongue dancing over her pronounced penance as she tried to locate the source. "Katja," she whispered as she began moving toward the inviting sound. What she found was not what she expected. The fallen warrior was beautiful, exquisite, even covered in blood, filthy from battle. She slowly knelt, her bare knees sinking into the mud. She brushed the hair out of his eyes and leaned down to see if he was still breathing. She could hear his heartbeat fluttering, feel small puffs of breath on her cheek. The wound on his side oozed rivulets of blood that flowed down and were swallowed by the earth. It wouldn't be long now. She looked around and reached out with her mind to see how safe it would be to feed. All was quiet. They were alone among the dead. She bent down over his prone form, using her hand to wipe away the mud from his neck. The difference in the skin color was striking, a pale white against his sun-kissed bronze. He was radiating more heat than any living creature should in the pre-dawn hours of autumn, and she knew there wasn't much time. She placed one hand firmly on his chest, exerting enough pressure to hold him in place, while the fingers of her hand gazed through his damp hair. She could feel herself tensing, and her tongue flicked out to lap at the tender skin under his jawline. Her lips curled back, and she felt his skin break as her razor-sharp teeth penetrated. Warm, sweet blood filled her mouth. She gulped down. He moaned, struggled, but she held him firm under her and continued to feast. It tasted like honey and warm spices. She could smell the ocean and feel the sun on her skin. Feeding was the only thing that allowed her to feel alive again. A cold tear slid down her cheek as the torrent turned into a trickle. He was almost gone, and the Valkyries would be here soon. She pulled away as the taste of him began to sour in her mouth. She may have been the handmaiden of death, but she would not strike the final blow. He was a warrior. He fell in battle and was bound for Valhalla. She would not change his fate by allowing the Valkyries to see him perish at her hand. She felt them close, watching, waiting to see if she would break her sacred oath. She would not. She released her grip on him and sealed the wound from her bite. That was one scar he would not take to the Great Hall. The sun was beginning to break over the horizon, and the morning fog was lifting. The remaining legion was at least half a day ahead now. She needed to move on, but something kept her rooted. She couldn't leave him. She briefly wondered if he was the presence she felt last night. She looked again at his beautiful face and was startled to see cobalt blue eyes staring back at her. They were the deep blue of the sky before a spring storm. She heard a clap of thunder behind her. She had waited too long. The The sky was suddenly black with the ravens, and the sharp cries bore into her. Gudrun, you defiled the battlefield with your presence. A deep female voice boomed. Her chest shook with the vibrations from it as she climbed to her feet and turned around. Her hand automatically moved to the hilt of her sword, and she had to force herself to drop it back down. She may have been long-lived, but she didn't feel like testing that immortality by fighting a Valkyrie on its territory. She learned a long time ago to choose her battles carefully. I didn't kill him, she replied, rising to her full height and shaking her head to clear the raven song. It's the only reason you're still standing, abomination. The Valkyrie's dark eyes slid over Gudrun with contempt and loathing. A raven alighted on the Valkyrie's shoulder, its wings spread wide to span her large frame, and directed its cold gaze at Gudrun. I was a warrior once, sister. Surely you remember the battles I fought, and those you took by my hand. She stared upward, meeting the Valkyrie's eyes while avoiding the ravens. I remember, the Valkyrie said, and her look became one of pity. You were a great warrior, Gudrun, but you are that no more. There is no longer a place for you in Valhalla, and I will not allow you to rob others of theirs. She began to draw her sword as she spoke, fire entering her eyes. Gudrun took a step back and scanned the surrounding area. She saw more Valkyries watching from the tree line, hands on their swords, ready to attack if given the signal. Ravens circled above, crying and shouting to one another. The dead lay still, silent witnesses to what was to come. All except her beautiful warrior, who was now sitting up, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him. She blinked once, thinking at the Valkyrie illusion, and looked away. When she looked back, he was still there, only now leaning on his sword for balance and climbing to his feet. What the? She didn't have a chance to finish the expletive before the Valkyrie's sword came swinging towards her. Instinct taking over, she twisted left, avoiding the massive blade. Her own sword was drawn a second later, and she turned back to face her enemy. Only instead of finding a rageful Valkyrie, she found those stormy blue eyes. She barely had time to meet them before I turned around, becoming a barrier between the two female warriors. Stop, he said. Suddenly the ravens fell silent, and both women lowered their swords. They continued to eye each other before shifting their gaze to the creature in front of them. What kind of trickery is this? Gudrun demanded. I'm cursed, not contagious. It's impossible to make more of my kind. She stared at the beautiful unknown in front of her, incredulous. Not impossible, said the Valkyrie. You were made. She receded her sword and signaled to the tree line. Claps of thunder filled the air as the complement left a battlefield. You are cursed, Gudrun, but you are no longer alone. He made his choice when he rose to stand with you, instead of entering the great hall. I relinquish my claim on him. I don't understand. Her head was spinning as she looked from the arisen warrior to the Valkyrie and back again. You don't need to, said the Valkyrie as she spun on her heel. The raven perched on her shoulder suddenly took flight. With a final booming thunderclap, the battlefield was once again deserted. She could feel those blue eyes on her and turned to face them. Am I dead? He asked, as he palpated the gaping wound on his side. It was slowly closing. He looked around the battlefield, then down at the patch of ground from which he had risen. The mud there was a dark crimson color. Gudrun saw him shudder, then looked back at her. "No, not dead," she said. "But not human anymore either. We need to move." She started walking toward the forest and heard her risen warrior follow a moment later. He caught up and they fell into a silent rhythm as he disappeared into the safety of the trees.